Can you tell us any funny behind-the-scenes moments that you had with any of them?
Well, I got to touch Blake's boots once. It was a phenomenal scene where she looked gorgeous and she had these amazing boots on. We were backstage and I was like, can I just touch them? And then afterwards I was mortified. I was like, did I really just ask if I could touch
I probably would have too. That's
shoes?
like all of our dreams and everybody in this room right now.
Hey besties, welcome back to my channel. Today, things are getting a little intense, especially if you've been following the drama in Texas. Now, I'm not physically in Texas myself, but that's exactly where all the action is happening, and trust me, it's wild. So, here's the latest. We've hit a real impasse, something none of us really saw coming. Well, I have to admit, I kind of did. But let me break it down for you so you can understand exactly what's going on. Last week, there was a major development in the legal saga. Judge Lyman officially dismissed Jed Wallace from the ongoing New York lawsuit. For those of you who've been keeping track, this was a huge turn of events because it shifts the whole dynamic of the case. Basically, Wallace is no longer a party in that lawsuit, which changes the strategies and stakes for everyone involved. And honestly, this isn't just a small update. It could have ripple effects we haven't even fully seen yet. I'm going to dive into what this means for Wallace, the other parties, and how it could impact the next steps in this legal drama. So grab your snacks, sit back, and let's unpack this mess together. So here's where it gets a bit complicated. Jed Wallace isn't a New York citizen, and he effectively argued that the New York court didn't have jurisdiction over him. After hearing the arguments, Judge Lyman agreed, saying something along the lines of, "Yes, Blake has not been able to prove that we have any jurisdiction over you. Blake Lively is allowed to refile in the proper court." And that's exactly where the drama started. Because, as I mentioned last week, if Lively were to refile her case in Texas, her previous motion to dismiss would essentially become moot. The tricky part? In Texas, Lively herself was arguing in federal court in Austin that the court there didn't have jurisdiction over her either. So now, we've got this tangled situation where both sides are questioning which court even has the authority to hear the case. This back and forth has created a real legal chess match. And it's fascinating to watch how each move affects the other. It's not just paperwork, it's a strategic battle that could completely shift the playing field for everyone involved. And trust me, the next steps are going to be just as interesting, if not more shocking. Lively argued that filing a Rule 202 petition for a deposition didn't automatically mean she was acknowledging that the Texas court had jurisdiction over her because technically, it wasn't an actual lawsuit yet. She made it clear that just traveling to Texas for the film, another simple favor, didn't prove that the court had authority over her. Nor did her loose connections to the state create jurisdiction. Essentially, Jed Wallace was trying to use these connections to establish some legal ground in Texas, but Lively pushed back hard. She was making the point that a few professional ties and occasional visits don't suddenly make a court her home turf. This back and forth has made the case a real tug of war over who actually has the right to hear the dispute. And it's honestly fascinating to watch the legal strategies unfold. What happened next was very similar to what Lively had done to Wallace in New York, and honestly, it didn't really work out for either of them. The Texas court ultimately sided with Lively, agreeing that it didn't have personal jurisdiction over her. The judge noted, "You're right, we don't have jurisdiction over you under personal jurisdiction." This case had been sitting in the Texas court for months, fully briefed since July, so it's kind of hilarious that the dismissal ended up being 21 pages long. Even funnier, the judge issued this detailed dismissal right after Jed informed the court that he had already been dismissed from his case against Lively in New York for lack of personal jurisdiction. Here's what the judge stated in the dismissal. Neither party claimed that the court had general personal jurisdiction over Lively. Instead, the plaintiffs argued that the court could assert specific personal jurisdiction because her contacts with Texas were less pervasive but supposedly connected to the dispute. The judge carefully analyzed these arguments and ultimately sided with Lively, emphasizing that occasional connections or professional visits weren't enough to establish jurisdiction. The judge went on to explain what specific jurisdiction actually means. Specific jurisdiction is a narrower form of authority that applies only when a defendant has deliberately engaged with the forum state and the lawsuit arises out of or relates to those contacts. In simpler terms, The court is saying that just showing up or having minor connections isn't enough. You have to have purposefully availed yourself of the state's opportunities, like actively doing business there, for the court to claim authority over you. This purposeful availment requirement exists to protect defendants from being dragged into courts in places where they don't really have meaningful ties. It ensures that someone like Lively, who may have occasional or indirect contacts with Texas like filming a movie, cannot be forced to defend herself there if those contacts aren't directly connected to the lawsuit. Essentially, the court is drawing a clear line between casual interactions and intentional engagement. And in this case, Lively's interactions were deemed too limited to justify jurisdiction. This clarification is huge because it sets a clear legal boundary and also explains why both the New York and Texas courts dismissed the claims Wallace and Lively were essentially playing legal ping pong. But the courts weren't having it. Jed tried to argue that Lively could be subject to Texas jurisdiction just because of her various somewhat random contacts in the state. He attempted to link her activities on unrelated projects to his case, essentially saying that her presence in Texas, even indirectly, should give the court authority over her. However, Lively presented several strong counterarguments. First, she pointed out that filing a Rule 202 petition in Texas did not automatically subject her to personal jurisdiction. Second, she argued that the Calder effect test, which is sometimes used to establish jurisdiction in defamation cases, did not apply to her situation. And finally, she maintained that the plaintiff's claims, based merely on information and belief, that she allegedly repeated defamatory statements while in Texas, were essentially a failed attempt to manufacture jurisdiction where none legitimately existed. In other words, Lively made it clear that she hadn't purposefully engaged with Texas in a way that would allow the court to claim authority over her. And the judge agreed. This part of the ruling underscores just how carefully courts evaluate jurisdiction claims, ensuring defendants aren't pulled into lawsuits in places where they don't really belong. And here's the kicker. Jed actually agreed on all counts. When I saw the way he was trying to weave personal jurisdiction over Blake, I had a feeling this case was going to get dismissed. But here's the thing. I truly believe this was more of a strategic choice by Jed rather than a complete misstep. With this dismissal, the court essentially agreed that the Rule 202 petition, which was Blake telling the court, "Hey, I'd like to take a deposition of this guy," did not give the court personal jurisdiction over her. Jed tried to argue that by filing it in Texas, she had somehow availed herself to the state's authority. The court disagreed because a Rule 202 petition is not an original action. It's procedural, not substantive. As for the Calder effect, the argument often used in defamation cases to establish jurisdiction, Jed tried to claim it applied, but the court saw through it. Lively's actions didn't meet the legal threshold for personal jurisdiction, and the judge made it clear that her limited connections to Texas simply weren't enough to pull her into this case. Jed argued that the CRD complaint, which forms the basis of this lawsuit, was directed at Texas, where both plaintiffs reside, and that it had undoubtedly caused them harm. He also pointed out that the draft complaint specifically mentioned Wallace as being based in Texas, framing it as though these facts should establish jurisdiction under the Calder effects theory. However, the judge disagreed with this interpretation. Simply mentioning Wallace's Texas ties in a complaint wasn't enough to meet the legal standard for personal jurisdiction. The court made it clear that the Calder effects test requires a direct connection between the defendant's actions and the forum state. And in this case, Lively's actions didn't satisfy that requirement. Essentially, the judge reinforced that mere references or indirect connections to Texas couldn't drag her into court there. The judge also agreed that claims based merely on information and belief don't provide substantial grounds to establish jurisdiction. In other words, the plaintiffs failed to show that Lively was actually subject to the court's personal jurisdiction. When a court determines that it lacks personal jurisdiction over a defendant, it has the authority to dismiss the case under Rule 12(b)(2). In this situation, the court's finding of no personal jurisdiction effectively resolves the matter, meaning the lawsuit cannot proceed against Lively in Texas unless it is properly filed in a court that does have authority over her. This ruling underscores a key principle in civil procedure. A plaintiff cannot manufacture jurisdiction based on loose connections or assumptions. The court has to see a real, purposeful link between the defendant and the forum state, and in this case, Lively's ties simply weren't enough. So here's the situation. The court granted Jed Wallace's motion to dismiss without even needing to address other